So as we get started with this afternoon's main event, it is my pleasure to tell you a little bit about our first keynote speaker. Dr. E.T.L. Dror is a cognitive neuroscientist who received his PhD from Harvard University in 1994 and has held a variety of academic appointments since that time. He is currently a senior researcher in the Center for Forensic Sciences at University College London, as well as the principal consultant for Cognitive Consultants International. Dr. Dror's academic work relates to theoretical issues underlying human performance and cognition. His research examines the information processing involved in perception, judgment, and decision-making. He has published well over 100 research articles and has given numerous trainings and workshops around the world. He has received research grants from multiple agencies in at least 3 different countries, including Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom, and has given too many to count invited lectures and keynote addresses in at least 18 different countries. I literally stopped counting. I was going cross-eyed. Dr. Dror has worked with the United States Air Force and in the medical domain, examining expert decision-making and error. In the forensic domain, he has demonstrated how contextual information can influence judgments and decision-making of experts. For example, he has shown that even in well-established lines of forensic evidence, such as fingerprint and DNA analysis, experts can reach different conclusions when the same evidence is presented within different extraneous contexts. In 2009, the National Academy of Sciences wrote a scathing critique of forensic sciences, wherein they looked at a variety of areas, including latent fingerprint analysis, firearms, bite marks, hair analysis, DNA, blood stain patterns, and concluded that there were some major problems, including wide variability, a lack of reliability, and an utter lack of the necessary research in these areas. Dr. Dror's research was heavily cited in this report, and his findings have been referred to as devastating to the forensic sciences. In essence, what Dr. Dror's research has demonstrated is that the same biases that afflict all human beings also afflict professionals and experts across multiple domains. Dr. Dror has worked with many U.S. forensic laboratories, including the FBI, NYPD, LAPD, San Francisco PD, Boston PD, and as well as laboratories and organizations in multiple countries, including the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Finland, Canada, Australia, to provide training and to implement cognitive best practices in evaluating forensic evidence. Dr. Dror was the chair of the National Institute of Standards and Technology's Forensic Science Human Factor Group and is a member of the Human Factors Group of the National Commission on Forensic Science. I have had the pleasure of collaborating with E.T.L. Dror on a variety of projects and have witnessed firsthand his unique ability to conceptualize and to come up with very practical solutions to long-standing, difficult problems. E.T.L. Dror is an engaging presenter who draws from his vast experiences in a wide variety of contexts to highlight the issue of cognitive bias and to provide practical solutions to mitigate the impact of these biases in various professional domains. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you our first keynote speaker for this conference, Dr. E.T.L. Dror.
Very happy to be here today. I hope my microphone is on. And I want to thank Professor Patricia Zapp and the organizing committee for inviting me here and giving me an opportunity to talk to you. I have a lot to talk about. We don't have a lot of time. I'm going to try in the end to leave time for questions that I will try to answer. But if not, you're welcome to catch me at the reception. I also put my email up there, so you're welcome to email me. And I'm going to go over a lot of papers and data and research. So if you want to actually read the paper, they put them all on the web. The address is up there, and you're welcome to access the web page with all the information. So I'm going to talk to you about some pitfalls in what you do, and it's not going to be necessarily very pleasant. Don't blame the messenger. I'm just telling you how it is. And I am going to challenge you, and I'm going to question some of the work you're going to do. You don't need to agree with me. All I ask is that you listen and consider it. And the reason I'm going to talk about the pitfalls because I want to talk about how to overcome them. But if we don't accept the limitations, the weaknesses, the pitfalls, it's very hard to start talking how we're going to overcome those weaknesses. So the work that you do is very important for the courts. The courts rely on you. The courts actually love you quite a lot, for good reason. You're coming. Experts, you present yourself as experts, and I assume that you tell the courts that you're unbiased and you're impartial, and the courts really need help and guidance in making decisions in a very difficult cases that are in front of them when they don't know everything that is going to happen. And you tell the court, I assume, you can later tell me if I'm wrong, that you're impartial, that you're unbiased, and you're using a lot of methods. Many of them are accepted, and validated in science, and you can cite many courts and many jurisdictions that have used what you've done. So all of this is good stuff, but there's a problem, only one problem, but it is a problem, is the brain, the human brain, and how it processes information, how you look at your patient, or the data, and how you draw conclusions, your interpretation, and that is a problem. And it doesn't matter, if you're doing some checklists, or if you're doing some measurement, to look at sex offenders, if they're going to have a risk to offend. And you can quote me, and we can discuss it later and say, that certain measures, are used all over the world and accepted by courts and the United States and Australia and Canada and the UK and many other countries, and show strong empirical evidence that about the validity and reliability. And we can cite meta-analytic analysis, for example, of over 60 studies that show very strong effect predictive case studies. So all of that is good, but I'm still going to show you the weaknesses, and not only in those measures, but in fingerprints and DNA, in more objective, pure scientific. And I feel quite confident that if fingerprint examiners and DNA examiners are susceptible, as all humans, to cognitive biases, you have the same weaknesses. But we need to kind of think about the weaknesses and vulnerabilities, and then if you don't think you suffer from them, then fine, you're wrong, but you can think that. I will try to show you. Now, 10 years ago, it was quite easy for me when I started to look at this domain to give talks, because the issue of cognitive bias was never heard of or existed in forensics. In 10 years, it's going to be easy because everyone will agree that it's a pitfall and a problem. Now we're in a transition. So I try to sell it to you. On the other hand, it's in the courts already, and you're going to be asked about it and been adopted. So it's a topic that's happening, and I'm not sure the audience here where they are between denial, not understanding cognitive bias, or obviously agreeing and knowing what it is, and we need to work together how to minimize it. So Francis Bacon, almost 400 years ago, realized that the brain doesn't enable us, and there are difficulties in looking at actually what's going on. And he came with a theory of idols, and this is the basis for all modern sciences, physics, chemistry. He laid down the foundation to modern sciences because he has a list of idols, idols of the tribe, of the cave, of the market, of the theater, that prevent us from looking and seeing what is actually there. And translating it, some of them refer to basic brain mechanism, to the cognitive architecture that is human nature. If you're a human and you have a brain, it's a problem in certain issues, and we need to understand them. And then we can go up and talk about your training, your experience, the culture, and then talk about the specific case. Anything in the specific case is going to distort and divert you from doing your work at the best way possible. And I'm going to try to translate all of this to forensic work and cover as much as I can in the time that I have. So this is a new hierarchy that I'm trying to develop that pertains not only to forensic work, but to the medical domain and many other domains, where I distinguish, first of all, between the observations of experts. not the conclusions where they have to do interpretation and judgment and decision making. Before that, what do they actually observe, what goes in the head, what actually registers as information, as data, whether it's an interview, whether it's scientific data, whatever data you use, I separate between the observations, what you actually observe, and then how you interpret it in judgment. And there are 8 layers, and the very top layer, when I'm talking about the bias between examiners. If you give 2 experts, and again, I'm going to pick on forensic work, but it's in the medical domain, US Air Force, in a range of domains that I worked, you give 2 experts the same data and you try to bias them by irrelevant information. Are they going to reach the same conclusion? So we're talking about bias between experts. So for example, here's a picture. You can make a judgment. Good looking guy, attractive. You're afraid of mere pitfalls? Yeah, anyway, it's not a scientific question. I think he's quite good looking. You don't have to agree. This guy, quite ugly, less looking. And we can make a judgment, which I assume that all of you will agree that the guy on the left is more attractive than the guy on the right. Now, of course, this is not an expert conclusion. It's subjective. And in psychology and other areas, we've been spending billions of dollars trying to understand what makes people attractive or not. But there's a lot of consistency. So the fact that a lot of your work is not scientific and it's art and opinion and subjective is not a bad thing. Some people attack it, and there is a big discussion now in the United States. If it's not objective, if there's no statistics, then you can't use it. I'm not saying that subjectivity is fine, experience is fine. Experts in many domains make subjective judgments that are very good and consistent. So here, it really doesn't matter to me what you think, how attractive they are or not. It's a matter of personal opinion. However, you will agree with me that when you assess somebody, it doesn't matter if they're attractive or not. That is a bias, not the bias of thinking if someone is attractive or not. But if they're attractive or not shouldn't change. However, a lot of research, not one piece of research, showed that the attractiveness matters when you get the same data and we post a picture of different people, you will assess differently, even in determining if someone is guilty or innocent, or how many years to send them to jail. And this is one reference. There are dozens of articles replicating that attractiveness of the person you're assessing affects assessment. And not only assessment that you do, but even verdicts of innocent and guilty. And as this paper said, attractive by guilty, and it's called physical attractiveness bias. So that is a bias that I'm talking about. And I'm moving to more hardcore, from determining if somebody is guilty or not, to determining how similar faces are. So you have 2 faces here, of 2 women, and you need to determine how similar the 2 faces are. And I can let you think about it for a few seconds, whether you're novices or expert forensic in facial comparisons and using software or not, and you need to determine how similar the faces are. Whether it's subjective or objective, I don't care about. I care about the bias that when we give it to different people, but we tell some people, these 2 people are genetically related, the mom and her daughter, and other people, we tell them they're genetically not related. We show 2 pictures of 2 men and say to some of them they're brothers, and to some we say they're unrelated. That is a bias, because we can argue how similar the faces or not, but the fact that you think it's a mother and a daughter, which they are, by the way, or you think they're not genetically related, doesn't change the images, how similar the nose or the eye or the hair or whatever you did. However, research shows, again, you can go to my webpage, if you don't read Latin, like father, like son, perceived resemblance and the belief in genetic relatedness. If you believe that the 2 people are genetically related, then your decision, your judgment of the relative similarity between the faces, they look to the brain as more similar. Moving to more basic decision, more objective, more scientific. So forensic anthropology, full skeleton, not a fragment, and making a simple decision, is it a male or female skeleton? So it's not a complicated decision that forensic experts make whether the person died from a trauma or not based on a segment of a bone. I have no idea how they do that. Here, full skeleton, including the pelvic bones. This is the female skeleton, and they have to determine the gender. However, we bias them. Before they see the skeleton, we plant ideas in their head. You know how the lawyers brief you and give you all the information? That's what they're doing, right? So we plant the idea that this is either a female skeleton or a male skeleton, and we can do it subtly by the name. If it's a male or female, we can do it stronger by having DNA results. They can excavate a skeleton, then the skeletons may wear male or female clothes. We have a different number of manipulations, but then they see the actual skeleton and they see a female skeleton. What do they decide when we give them the context? They come with a frame of mind, an expectation that it's a female skeleton. All of them say it's a female skeleton. But what happens when they come and they expect a non-female skeleton, the female skeleton? It drops to 38%. On a simple decision. And again, if they're all paper, you can read all the data if you want. So this is differences when you bring different experts looking at the same actual forensic data, but coming with irrelevant information that causes them to misinterpret, make wrong judgment and decision making. That's level 8. This is the best level. As we go down, it gets worse. You're already looking quite depressed, and that's okay because there will be solutions, but I need to demonstrate some of the problem. So as we move down in the conclusion, I'm asking not whether two different experts will reach different conclusions when you put them in a state of mind, because they're two different people, different individual differences, training, whatever. If you give the same data to the same expert at two different times that they don't remember, will they reach the same conclusion? Obviously, yes. But no, the data is different, and this is one of the first studies that I did that caused a lot of noise. We're talking about fingerprints. That is a highly used, most used for the longest time, and passes Dolbert hearings and Fry hearings, if you know, in the United States and in the UK and everywhere else. When you give the same expert the same pair of fingerprints, will they reach the same conclusion? When you give irrelevant context, because they make their decision based on the fingerprint, it doesn't matter if the person confessed to the crime or somebody else and what the detective thinks and the eyewitnesses. And if it matters, it's okay as long as they go to the court and say, you know, I looked at the fingerprint, but I knew that the person confessed and I knew about the eyewitnesses. No, they said, I'm objective, I have zero error rate, and this is a decision that I make an expert. When in fact, this context affects their decision making, and I do this experiment when they don't know they're even being tested. They think they're using real cases, and really what we did in this study, I won't give you all the details because there's a whole bunch of papers on that. I went to real criminal cases where a fingerprint expert appeared in front of the court and identified someone, 100%. I'm sure, I'm unbiased and I'm impartial. And we gave the same fingerprint to the same expert in a different context, and 80% said the fingerprint doesn't match. On things they actually said match 100%. So this is bias not between, but the same expert looking at the same data in their conclusions. Getting to more trouble. Let's not talk about bias, let's talk about reliability. So reliability, I'm talking about the scientific, not the legal sense that is used in the court. Forget about the bias. What happens if you give different examiners, this is reliability between forensic people, the same data to two different exams, and don't manipulate the context, don't put irrelevant information so they think differently. I was sure that's not going to be an issue. Bias was obviously going to affect them. And you can see in a whole range of domain that without bias, this is footwear, you give cases and there is differences between probable to possible to inconclusive to something that I make identification versus some, you know, you can see a whole spread of opinions of different examiners looking at footprints where they have a scale. And even better on DNA. So this is a study I did with DNA mixture, and we're giving it to 17 examiners from the same laboratory, using the same training, the same standard procedure. I'm not talking about different labs, same laboratory, and we're giving them mixture DNA, and then we're giving them a suspect, and they have to say, can this suspect be a contributor to this DNA mixture? It's a gang rape, and here the suspect, can or can't he be a contributor? 17 examiners. Some of them said, yes, he can be a contributor. Some of them say impossible, and some of them said it's inconclusive, I can't decide. This has now been replicated by the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the United States and the US Army Criminal Investigation Lab, where they don't make a decision if somebody can or cannot be a contributor. They use statistical tools to determine probability. Same laboratory, same statistical tools, same data. They come up with totally different statistical results, not minute differences. So this is reliability between experts, give the same information, no bias, no context to different examiners. Now we're moving to the lowest leveling, the conclusions. What happens if we give the same examiner the same data and not bias them at all, no bias, will they reach the same conclusion? And this is a study by the FBI, following up on some of my findings, where they take a whole bunch of fingerprint examiners who come to court with such powers, right? They're not making, judgments, is a person, going to offend or not, and some of the things that many of you do. We're talking about fingerprints, and they come to the court and say, I'm 100% sure, and I don't make mistakes, and all the things they say in the hearing. And they gave the same fingerprints to the same examiner twice, and 10% of the time, they reach different conclusions. So it's not my day in court whether I'm going to jail or not, depends if examiner A or examiner B looks at my fingerprint from the crime scene, and then I'm lucky if it's examiner A and not so lucky if it's examiner B. Different people. The same examiner, one time they'll say one thing, another time 10%, according to the FBI study, and we have other studies, they would reach a different conclusion on the fingerprint without biasing them, without telling them the suspect confessed to the crime or didn't confess. Then we can go up to 80% when we plant ideas in their head. So all of this pertains to conclusions, to the conclusions that is done based on interpretation, judgments, and decision-making. Now I want to move to the more basic. Forget about the judgment and the interpretation. Let us just think about the observations. What you see. Let's not talk what it means, but what is the data? When you do an interview, before you think what it means and draw a conclusion, or you do some kind of interview, what do you take out before you start reflecting on the data? What is the data that you observe, what you perceive? So 11.4, we bias examiners. Between two examiners, we have two examiners, we plant some ideas in their head based on irrelevant information, gossip, right? What the detective thinks, what the lawyers want you to do, nothing to do with the actual assessment of the information. And we look what they observe, and we do it with fingerprints, and they look at the fingerprint from a crime scene. They don't have even a suspect, and they see different things depending on the bias that we plant in their head. Then you go to the same examiner. What happens if the same examiner looks at the same fingerprint, not my research, somebody else's research? What do they see? And the same examiner sees different characteristics and different data in a fingerprint. Before they compare it to the suspect, what they actually see, what the data is in there, in a well-defined domain of fingerprinting, which I'm more than happy to talk about. We're getting slowly to the bottom of the pyramid. What about reliability? Let's not bias them. Let's take the holy fingerprint, the most used forensic evidence in court, been used for the longest time. Let's not tell them that it's somebody who stole a bicycle or a murder, or they confessed to the crime or not. Just let them look at the fingerprint. What do they see? So here's some data. We have, we give them 10 fingerprints, and to 10 different fingerprint exams, and they count the minutia. So they're not even comparing, they count the minutia, their characteristics, well-defined, objective characteristics of what is the data in the fingerprint. And as you can see, there's a huge variance. Look at the minimum max between different examiners, huge huge range in what they see. And if they see a small number, like a 7, then they will never make an identification later when they have to draw a conclusion. But if they see a 14, they may make an identification. So the conclusion whether I'm going to jail or not, if I'm executed or not, depending which country, which state in the United States, depend on which examiner is looking at the fingerprint and what they observe. This is our observation. And now I'm getting to the bottom of the pyramid. What about if we give the same fingerprint to the same examiner and we don't bias them? We don't tell them anything about the case, no gossip, just give them a fingerprint and they count the minutiae that they see. And then you give them the same fingerprint a week later and they count the minutiae, same instructions, same fingerprint, same exam. This is the very, very basic. In a science, we cannot start talking if we don't agree. In physics, we want to talk about gravity, we all have to agree how it's falling. If everyone sees something else, we've got nothing to talk about. So it's not different people, the same person looking at the same fingerprint. This is in time 1, time 2. I'll make it easier, subtract time 1 from time 2. So 0 means they have the same number. And if you look at the data, again, 10 latent print examiner who appear in court, who work in real cases, 10 fingerprints. Some of them see the same number. That's without the bias, and they're not even comparing it and making any judgment, just looking at the fingerprint. Some have a discrepancy of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The same person with the same fingerprint. So this is kind of, again, it's all published research. It's been replicated. When I given 6 workshops to the NYPD and everywhere, and the fingerprint exam, I'm not very popular with them. So I don't want them to believe them. I know I bring magnifying glasses, I bring fingerprints, I say bring a fingerprint, and I show it to all of them and say count the minutiae, and then I say okay, let's go around the room, and they all expect the same number, and every time we go and they give all the numbers, and they say, oh, we were looking at the different fingerprint. No, and they're themselves shocked because I'm not accusing them, I'm not accusing you of intentionally exaggerating your data, of being biased and playing a game. If you're dishonest, that's good because it's easy to find you. The problem is widespread because it's hardworking, dedicated people like yourself who believe you're fighting crime and you're helping the defense or you're helping the prosecution and you're contributing to the legal justice system, where in fact you're diverting it from administering justice because of unintentional biases that occur in here. And this makes trying to make a bit of organization. It's a paper that's not out yet. It will be out very soon on this distinction between different levels of expertise and where things can go wrong. Now back to Sir Francis Bacon. All these problems, where do they come from? Where do you get contaminated for bias or reliability? So now I want to kind of bring where you get contaminated and start talking about solutions, because it looks like you all look very sad, so I'm doing a good job, and you're all depressed, so you're all with me, or not, we'll find out later. And now we can start thinking what we can do to solve it, to minimize it, to deal with problems of this sort. So first of all, the case itself. You're looking at evidence, and sometimes the evidence is contaminated by irrelevant information, things that affect you because of how the brain processes information. I'm not going to go into cognitive science 101. And if you're looking at bite marks, somebody said they like to talk about bite marks and examining bite marks. Sometimes there is emotional, contextual information. I'll put this on, I see the pictures are bothering some of you. Information that's in the evidence. And sometimes you can't take it out. Right? You need to interview a suspect or someone who is guilty, who's been in jail. You need to interview how severely the problems are. So you have to talk to them. So talking to them exposes you to a whole range of problems. Well, can you solve it or not? You need to start thinking. Some things you can solve. In handwriting, experts compare signature they see the entire letter. So in the Netherlands National Police, they have a new procedure. The expert that compares the signature doesn't get the entire letter when it's typed, so it doesn't have the context. In the UK, by the way, I'm doing this research, I don't know what we're going to find. There's been a decision about Muslim women, whether they need to show their face when they're testifying, so the jurors can see. I believe that if everybody hides their face, the jurors will be better at telling the truth or not. So now we're doing an experiment, and the conclusion is not that Muslim women need to uncover their face, everybody should cover their face, because then the jurors will be better at judging. We're collecting the data will speak. So we need to think about the creativity of how and if you can, and I don't know every forensic domain, but every forensic domain now in the National Institute of Standards have 24 committees on every forensic domain, even forensic wildlife. I never heard about it. Now I know what it is. They have 24 and they're starting to think, how can we isolate certain information when you look at the actual data. Sometimes it's not possible because the irrelevant context, what I call the gossip, not your area of expertise, is in the evidence that you're going to be exposed to it. If you're going to be exposed to it and you can't avoid it, life is not perfect. And that happens. Just, when you write your report and when you testify in court, try not to overstate your evidence, try to point out to the limitations, to the weaknesses. Every science has limitations and weaknesses, so don't go in court like many of you do and exaggerate and don't mention. Volunteer, don't wait for the cross-examination, that you're exposed to a lot of information in the data that may have affected your judgment in this case. So that's the case evidence. But then you have reference materials. You have reference materials, whether it's standards that you work from, whether it's a theory, whether it's a suspect, whatever your domain, and many people work backwards. They don't go from the evidence to the standard, from the evidence to the suspect. They work from the suspect to the evidence. From the standard, they're guided by the standard, by the suspect, and that distorts the interpretation of the evidence. And I like to say, like the Romans do archery, bow and arrow. They hit the tree, and they draw the target. Always bullseye. It's backward tracking, circular reasoning, where you're really not guided as much by the evidence as you are by the standards that you're working towards, the boxes, whatever they are. This is a UK case. Levi Belfield, if you remember, a serial murderer, likes to follow young women. They go on the bus, he drives behind them, and then he comes from behind with a blunt instrument, baseball bat or hammer, and hits them on the back of the head until they die. And then he doesn't rape them, he doesn't steal their money. That's what he does. And forensic examiners identify the car based on this. This is an image from the bus. In the UK, we have lots of CCTV, closed circuit television. And this is a single image, and he recognizes two of them, two forensic people recognize the car. Not very helpful because there's 26,000 of them. And then you have the license plate, the registration plate. Not very clear, is it? But you have two forensic people coming to court and testifying about it. But what happened? They're not lying, they're not. The detectives come and say, have you heard of all the murders in London, and all of them want to solve the crime? That we found the person who did it. It's Levi Belfield. Here is the car registration number of Levi Belfield. They see that first, and then they show it. Can you see it here? And then they're going backwards, and it's not that they're intentionally lying. It's like the two faces. When you believe they're genetically related, they look more similar. When you have in here the license plate of the serial murderer, who the police believe and know and convince, and the prosecution has brought them in and they want to help and they're part of the system, then you get it. And in a recent case in the UK, I'll talk about the US in a minute, I'm going to be in Australia in September, they, over a court of appeal, has squashed a case where a forensic examiner reached conclusions 100% and the person was convicted of murder. But then when you look at inside, before they had the suspect and they observed the evidence, the forensic examiner said, I can never make an identification because the quality and quantity of information is not enough to ever make an identification. Suddenly they're the target, they're the standard, they're where they're going, and suddenly they sit in the actual evidence. In the FBI in the United States have changed their procedures in fingerprinting. Now they're doing it in DNA also, where the examiners are not allowed to see the suspect. You first of all have to look at the DNA profile from the crime scene. You have to develop the profile, and after you have the profile from the crime scene and you document it, only then you're allowed to look at the DNA profile of the suspect. You have a fingerprint from the crime scene, you have a suspect. You're not allowed to look at the fingerprint of the suspect until you look at the fingerprint from the crime scene, you characterize it. So avoiding the flexibility in the rationalization. We call it linear sequential unmasking. It's a whole procedure of context management. That's what we're developing. I said we'll talk about solutions. So this is an example of a solution where we say irrelevant information don't need to know. When the lawyer calls you, if you're working for the defense or even for the prosecution, what's the first thing they do? I try to stay away out of court as much as I can. What do? They brief you. Let me tell you about the case. You have to tell them to shut up and to tell you only the relevant thing you need. Because they start telling you stories and what's going on, and you get pulled into the adversarial system. I'll talk about the adversarial system. In the UK case that I was in, my side won, and they invited me to a barbecue. Said, why are you inviting me for a barbecue? Why do I care if the person was found innocent or guilty? I'm a scientist. I'm coming to provide forensic work, to bring assessment of the evidence. And I'm not celebrating, and I'm not sad, and I'm not happy if they're convicted, not convicted, and how they're assessed. It's about context management. Don't be exposed to irrelevant information. One, if they want to give it to you, because many times, I hate to break the news to you, not always, but many times they bring you in, they don't care what you have to say, they want you help in convicting a person or finding that a person is innocent. You're a tool. Science is not used by the court, it's abused and misused, and sometimes you unintentionally get in this game, whereas you really are the light. Forensic work is where we can bring and put this justice system, which is problematic, as much as possible on the scientific and the correct path. And linear sequential unmasking is a procedure that we've developed that requires in any kind of evidence, do not be exposed to irrelevant information. And when they want to give it to you, then the way to politely say no is to say, this cognitive bias stuff is coming up in court more and more. And they're going to ask me what you briefed me, what I knew, and my evidence is going to be more powerful and stronger if I say, I didn't know this and I didn't know that. What you need to know, what's relevant or not, is for you to decide, because you're the experts. Do you need to know the past number of cases that this person has been convicted of rape? If you're assessing, sexual behavior in the future, maybe you do. If you're looking at DNA profile in this specific case, it's totally irrelevant. So you need to be the judges of what's relevant or irrelevant. So moving on to irrelevant information, I've started to talk about, and there's a lot of communication, non-verbal communication, briefing. Does anyone ever have a case when they're not briefed? The first thing, the lawyers, when they contact me, and I get dozens of invitations, I rarely accept them because I work with the forensic community, and they're very much don't like me to appear in court and say that they're biased. The first thing they start telling me, hey, stop. Don't tell me what I don't need to know. You want me to do something? Tell me only what the very, very minimum of what I need. Don't start. Let me give you the background of the case. I don't want a background of the case. What do I care about the background? You want me to assess this piece of evidence. You want me to look at this? Great. Send me the relevant information. And the exposure to irrelevant information is very strong when I'm talking about formally. For example, this is the case. Again, I don't want to say what jurisdiction. I'm not here to make fun of any country or detective or state, but this is a request for fingerprinting, very strong domain. I'll pick on fingerprinting and DNA, because if it's just fingerprint and DNA, you can be assured that it's in the more soft areas of forensic work. So first of all, we see that the victim was white and the suspect was black. Is that relevant to fingerprint examiners? I'm not a fingerprint examiner, but I asked them, they all say race is irrelevant. So what do you need to know that it's a murder case, that a black guy killed a white guy? Okay, but then it gets much better on the bottom. Let me zoom in on it for you. So the detective writes, the above listed suspect is the person who pulled the trigger. Make every place to put them in the truck. The only one witness riding the trunk was too drunk to make an identification. So they need your help. They're telling the fingerprint examiner that this person is a murderer. You know it's not England, because they didn't say, please make every effort to identify them. I'll give you that. And then putting more pressure by saying that the only witness, the one witness that they have in the truck is too drunk to make an identification. It's all up to you. The Massachusetts Supreme Court, just a few months ago, overturned the conviction because they showed that the prosecutor was so involved and put so much pressure on the forensic examiner, and she was not very smart. She put it in writing saying, that bastard may go and rot in hell and I know he's guilty, and a lot of that, the Supreme Court overturned this. Now this is in writing. Now they're getting more sophisticated. They don't put it in writing, and you go out to the barbecue and you meet in the hallway and you go out to the pub, and there's a lot of exchange of information. But here, just to show you, this person is sitting in jail based on identification that was done. And the examiner, the person doing the forensic work, said, I'm objective, I'm not affected by that. But that's not possible, because that's not how the cognitive system works, because you're intelligent and you process information and context is taken into consideration. The forensic domain, especially DNA and fibers and hair, are very, very sensitive to physical contamination. And I try to talk about cognitive contamination. You need to think about contaminating. And after a lot of hate mail, and I'm happy to share a lot of the hate mail and personal insults that go in this domain. Now it's much better. When I started, the name they used to call me, do I have time to tell you? It's really nice. Not really, I want to leave some time for questions, but over reception I can tell you all I have a file, a hate file, but now it's changing. So now it's changed. If I'm not convincing you, you better get on board, because I would look stupid 10 years ago. Now you're looking stupid if you call and say I'm objective. Because in the US, for example, and I bring examples from other countries, there's the US National Commission on Forensic Science. So the US National Commission on Forensic Science 6 months ago adopted the document, and it's on my webpage, but the title of the document is Ensuring that Forensic Analysis is Based Upon Task-Relevant Information. It's a whole document saying you should not be exposed to irrelevant information, and forensic analysis work. The analysis that you do has to be on relevant. Tell me everything you know. That's what you're going to be asked when you cross-examine. Everything you knew about the case. Did you need this? Was this relevant? Yes. Is this relevant? This is not relevant. Why did you know it? Are you violating the National Commission on Forensic Science? And it's not only the National Commission on Forensic Science, it's the National Institute of Standards and Technology, it's the Attorney General is coming out with guidelines soon. It's going more and more. In the UK, the Forensic Science Regulator, 5 years ago, you can go to my webpage, it's very entertaining. The BBC had a discussion between me and the Forensic Science Regulator, me saying there's a problem, and he saying, no, it's no problem, it's nonsense. And it's nice, it's very polite, it's British, it's so polite that the producer of the program later said to me, you know he hates your guts, because I didn't notice, he was so polite telling me I'm an idiot, I didn't even notice, but it was made clear to me later. 5 years later, the forensic regulator issues guidance how to minimize cognitive bias. In the first paragraph saying, cognitive bias is a problem in every forensic domain. And here are guidelines adopting, by the way, like the US National Commission, linear sequential unmasking and other procedures. The side note, 5 years ago, it was a male forensic regulator who was a police officer in the past. And now it's a woman who is a scientist. So I didn't even have to argue with the scientist. You know, everybody knows science 101, double blind, placebos, all of this stuff is kind of obvious, should be obvious to all the audience here. Base rate expectation. Moving down the pyramid. Am I going too fast or are you with me? Everybody's sleeping? Okay. So, base rate, basically, humans and people like you, experts, are very, very smart. You learn from experience. You go to a case, and what makes you an expert is a whole range of things. But one thing is that you've been doing it for many years, and you're assessing this person who was convicted and is coming out on parole, and you have to do some assessment. It's not your first case. You've done before 10, 20, 100. I don't know how many you've done. And you bring all the baggage of the 100. Baggage is experience and expertise. That's why you're an expert. That's why they pay you a lot of money, right? To hear your opinion because you've done so many cases. But this case is this case. And all your past experience may be irrelevant to this case, but that's a bias because you're prejudging a lot about what's happening here based on your experience. What happens in airport security? They train them and they're hardworking, dedicated to find bombs and knives and guns on the check-in luggage. And they go in the first day at the airport, and you can see them at the airport, and they look at the no bomb, no bomb, no bomb, no bomb, no bomb, no bomb. For the first day. Second day, a week, a month, a year, 5 years, 20 years they're going to do it. How many bombs are they going to find? None. Zero. Right? That's the reality. We may take our shoes off and our belts off and the liquids, but they don't find bombs. 6 million people were flying yesterday, give or take. They didn't find a single one. If they did, it would be on CNN right away. And today, I haven't heard the news, but I'm willing to bet with you that they will not have no bomb and not tomorrow. So what happened, the screen people, they learn from experience. So even though the brain wants to engage, they learn, and their experience tells them, hey, a bomb is not going to be there. And it doesn't matter how much they try and they're motivated. Before they see the X-ray, they've seen thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. There was never a bomb. So they don't do that. And the same in verification. So in many forensic domains, work of one examiner is verified by another one. But they always verify. So before they actually see the opinion of the first examiner, they verify always, and they get to be a rubber stamp. Because the brain, is kind of engaging. You learn from experience. That's what makes you experts. It works with technology, computer, statistics, a whole bunch of papers on that. Let me give you an example. I want you to do a quick exercise. I'm going to put something up here, and I want to see my esteemed, intelligent colleagues counting how many F's you can see in this paragraph. So if you can count the number of F's, no time pressure. I need some exercise, so I'll go down, and I'm not going to be. So, they're super esteemed. I don't want to. Do you want to tell me how many F's you see, or 3? How many people see 3 F's? Pick up your hand. Most people see 3. Some people see 4. There are 6 F's. 6. I didn't ask if you saw 6. I'm telling you, there are 6. And only most of you see 3, 4, and 5. Now I'll point to the 6. Look very well. Look really well. Okay. At least the president of John Jay is not here to see this, okay? Can't count to 6, okay? I'm going to count. Pay attention slowly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now all the people, I didn't ask if you saw 6, because the people who saw 3 or 4 or 5, you are real smart. You're experts in reading, because only idiots, that's why they want to put the hand, if you're 6, read everything. When you start reading, you read of, but the brain of an expert learns it's a waste of time to read. The brain has limited resources. Why read something that's meaningless? And we bring students in the UK, I pay them £1, $1.50 to count every F. And they can drink legally at 18 in the UK. Happy hour, they get a beer and a pizza for £1. They don't count the 6 F's. Because when you start reading, you read every letter, every word. But experts, you learn. I just talked about base rate, right? I'm talking about base rate. You learn from experience. So what do you learn over time? Reading the of and the are and the is a waste of time because you know it's not important. And when I put it, even if you're motivated, even if you're all hesitant to say anything, it's unconscious, automatic, and without awareness. So when you deal with cases and you're experts and you see dozens and hundreds and thousands of cases, you know where the interesting in what is irrelevant information. The brain automatically, and it's not a matter of willpower, ignores information. The brain can process all the information. And the base rate, your experience that guides you, you read very fast and very well because you don't waste time reading of and are and that. You want to read where the information is. And an expert medical doctor, only the medical students goes one by one, and the nurses only the first week go in the checklist, and they learn from experience. If you've ever been in an ICU, an intensive care unit, it's very serious, 40-50% die, and they have monitors. If someone is starting to die, that they go off, beep, 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 and to force the nurses and the doctors, you have to go. You cannot turn it off in a control room. You have to go to check the patient and press a reset. So the first day, the doctor, the junior doctor, the nurse are standing there. They're watching the X Factor or Game of Thrones or whatever, or eating donuts or whatever they do. And the alarm goes off. They drop everything. They run to the patient. They check the patient. The patient is fine. They go reset. They sit down. They're just about to eat another bite of the donuts. The police don't like the donut jokes. Here you have it. Again, it goes off, they run again, and the patient is fine. The monitors are set at a very, very low threshold because the companies who make them, one case, the monitor won't go off and the person dies. What is the family going to do in the US? Sue the company for millions. So they set the threshold 99.5% false alarms. 1 out of 200 times it goes off. So if you're in an intensive care unit, you probably don't know because you're unconscious, but if you're visiting someone, you will see what happens. It goes off and the doctor or the nurse come, they don't look at the patient and they press a reset button. Because they learn from experience. After it goes 7 times in 1 minute, they may check if they're breathing or not and start CPR or whatever. This is a basic characteristic of intelligence and expertise, and this is base rate. So when you bring in your past cases, it causes you automatically to pay attention or to not to pay attention. This is part of the sources of of the problem. We need to acknowledge it, and it's a problem. Now we're moving to organizational factors. So, out of curiosity, how many of you appeared in court in your life? Pick your hand up. Almost all of you. And how many of you appeared for the defense only or mainly? Only or mainly for the prosecution? Half and half? Or that's great that even though most of the people who appeared in court didn't vote on all the options, but it's quite good if you have different experiences, and the adversarial system is very problematic to be a forensic examiner, especially in the US, because it's like on steroids. Say just like in England, in the UK, they're still adversarial, but it's not it's bad, but not as bad. The prosecution wants a record, and the defense wants a record, and they're out of control, and they put you inside in the middle of a war there between the prosecution and the defense, or different pressures, and you need to get in and not be briefed and not be manipulated when they want to manipulate you and use you. Let's take a domain. We talked earlier about, or I mentioned the PCLR and static 99R. How many of you used either one of them in your life? Pick your hand up. Oh, many of you. It's great measures, right? I quoted meta-analytic analysis of 60 papers shows it's reliable, it's valid, it's great. But look at the data. So this researcher, UVA, Dan Mary and other people went and hired over 100 forensic psychologists like yourself to use it. And all they didn't manipulate it like me and say, oh, the person is raped 1 million times, or the person, is a virgin or whatever. No gossip. gave them the same information, didn't lead them to expect any results like I did. I'm an extreme guy, so I went to the extreme stuff. They did it more subtle. All they did is told half of the forensic specialist, expert, objective, impartial, and unbiased, like yourself, of course, that told half of them, hello, I'm from the prosecution. And the other half, they said, I'm from the defense, to check if they have what's called an allegiance effect. What does it matter if you work for the prosecution, for the defense? You get the data, you look at it, if you remember the hierarchy. And if you look at the data, again, you can read the paper. So here are the scores on the PCLR in static 99R. 4 cases, 3 out of the 4 cases, look at the huge differences. If they believe they're working for the prosecution or believe they're working for the defense, huge score differences. Case 4, not a lot. And again, with this one. So these are organizational factors. They call it the allegiance effect. But again, we're talking a lot of different kinds of things that affect what you think, how you interpret information. And remember to the beginning of the talk, for example, the faces. If you believe they're genetically related, the faces look similar. So when you're doing one of your more, and I don't mean to offend you, but more subjective measurements, you rely a lot on self-report of the people you're talking, you interview them and you hear what they say. You're not actually, it's relied on self-report and you make judgment and interpretation. That's your expertise and you know what you're doing because, maybe not, but you get paid for it anyhow and the court loves you and believes any. And here is data, and again, you can read the paper for detail where the belief which side you're working on affects, use very reliable and valid measures that many of you have used before. Not much time left. I do want to leave time for questions. I don't want to have much more to say, but I've been saying things that I think annoy you, or should I know you, and I want to give you an opportunity to give me back what I gave you. It would only be fair. So I'm going to leave time for questions, but as we go down to the pyramid, talk about training and motivation. Why are you in this domain? Ask your students, why are you going to this domain? Fighting justice. You know, my aunt was raped, or my cousin was wrongfully convicted, and all emotional, and you hear speeches about Orlando and about this. I don't want to hear that. I'm trying to be a scientist. All these stories contaminate my mind. I didn't want to interrupt people who are speaking, but this is science, you know. Let's take that as much as possible, the emotions out of it and all the motivations out of it. We're not going to be able to do it to a human. But let's minimize it, not put flame into the fire. And basic motivations, ask past questionnaires, we do that. And you'll find people who come to this domain have strong ideologies. Before you even train them, after you train them, before they look at the evidence, they already have a disposition to do one thing or the other. And when we get to the very bottom, now we're talking about a specific case information, environment, culture, experience. Now we're getting to the bottom, to the human nature, to the human brain, where there isn't much to do. It can't change your brain, but you can start thinking of minimizing the information, whether or not being exposed to it, or sequencing what is where. Remember the example of the F, regardless of your opinion, who is more or who is less attractive, and I don't know if you have to see the people you're assessing. Maybe you're assessing someone who is really, really good looking, or is really not good looking. Don't say it doesn't affect me, because it affects. It's one of the stronger predicting also of hiring people, renting your house, more than race and gender and age, attractiveness. It's very, very strong. Then you have to see them. You don't have an option to cover their face, but then maybe go to a colleague and show them your interview result without showing the face and see if they say the same. I always do it, you know, when I grade exams or mark exams, depending on the country, what language, and I use a seminar and I know the students, and some of them are more attractive and some are less attractive, and some of them I like and some of them I can't stand. Yes, I'm a human being, you know, we're not supposed to say we treat all the students as but we don't. So we take a measure. If some student you're failing and it's a student that you don't like, then maybe you can give it to another professor to have a look like, to look at the exam, to look at the paper. What do you think about it? And if they say it's a real good paper and you fail them, then look for another professor. Give it to another professor. And they too say it's a great paper. So you go to, and every professor you give it says it's a good exam and you failed them, then you need to say, I didn't do it intentionally, I really tried to block it out, but this is who we are, this is the nature of the brain, and you take measures. So if you have a case that for whatever reason you believe you're objective and you want to be objective, and I believe that, truly believe that, but it's some big emotional thing. You're going to some Orlando, the next Orlando, and you're asked to assess, the competence of the person who blew up children in a nursery, in a daycare, and the most horrible kind, It's very emotional, it's going to affect you, but then after you assess and you do your question, give it to another colleague. Don't tell them it's from that case. Have them look at the data without knowing, to do some kind of quality control, because what you believe affects not only a kind of soft assessment, but whether someone is guilty or not, how similar faces are, and your past experiences. And this all has to do with the brain. And I have very, very limited time, and I'm going to finish in 1 minute, because I want to give you at least a few minutes for questions, and haven't had time to go into the cognitive and brain mechanisms. And many of you know that, so I don't want to be patronizing and start talking about top-down processing and all of psychology and cognitive science, 101 for undergraduates talk about it. That's all there is almost in psychology. So it applies to forensic scientists, it applies to forensic psychologists, it applies to medical doctor. Every human endeavor, it applies, and when you're an expert, it applies to you even more, because part of being an expert are cognitive mechanisms that change how we process information, how we use different experiences, how we chunk things together, and affects us potentially more than even people who are not expert. And what we're trying to do now, after years of resistance, is to try to make sense of this. So this is a kind of a pyramid that Professor Zaff and I are working and developing. It's under review, I believe, right now, and trying to understand the sources, because the sources are the pitfall. And then if we know the sources, we can start talking maybe how we can overcome them. Sometimes we can't. It's in the case evidence. You can't avoid it. That's life. Life is not perfect, but at least let's acknowledge the weaknesses. And I don't know, when you appear in court, how much you talk that you're perfect and you're objective and impartial, and how much you exaggerate the evidence and how much you actually say what you have to say. And then developing hierarchies. So we see different aspects of where people are biased, where people are reliable, what are the weaknesses. And this is, again, I'm now trying to do not in the forensic domain, I'm trying to look at other domains. And again, it's all in the paper if you want to read it later. So the pitfall we want to overcome. I want to finish on the optimistic. We can overcome many of them. Not eliminate, but we can minimize the pitfalls. But we first of all need to acknowledge the pitfalls. We need to be honest to the science that we're doing, to the art that we're doing. And in court and in our reports, acknowledge that this domain is not perfect, and emphasize not to wait for the cross-examination, not get pulled into the system. Thank you very much. So I believe we have about 10 minutes left for questions. And if there's no questions, I will take it as total agreement. I'll be very happy. But I believe there are people with microphones, so if you could just introduce yourself if you're asking a question. Like students, you're afraid to be the first one, yeah. You have a question here.
Shall I shout?
No, the microphone is coming. I know who you are, but maybe not everyone. And I know where you live before.
Well, thank you. Again, I've had the pleasure of hearing you before, and it's always good. And one of the problems that we face, I think, particularly for people in this field, and one of the challenges that we would have to masking, is to try to determine what information is irrelevant. If we are forced to do evaluations of somebody, like, say, for personality assessment, you were talking about things like the psychopathy checklist, it's difficult to know what information about somebody's life is irrelevant. And it's also difficult to take somebody's life and perhaps deconstruct it or decontextualize it into chunks. And, I can think of the top of my head of a few things that might be helpful, but I'd be interested in hearing what your suggestions are for us to try to maintain greater objectivity if part of our evaluations involve assessing broad characteristics of people or people broadly.
Okay, so that's a 1 hour answer. I'll give you the highlights in 2 minutes. First of all, it's a great question and a great start to say, let's think what's relevant or not, and not the answer, I need to know everything. Everything is relevant, that we hear still quite a lot in certain forensic domains. Two, on a very general level, before a specific case, I want to answer you about a specific case. On a general level, why don't you sit in your next conference or have some expert group and start talking what is relevant or not, and come up with a list for different evaluations, and you'll be able to say, for this evaluation, this is relevant. For this evaluation, this is not relevant. And for this, maybe not, depending on the case. That's what they're doing in many forensic science domain NIST. And I went to the 24, when I was the chair of the cognitive issues, to the 24 DNA, fingerprint, wildlife, firearm, handwriting, blood splatter, 24, and convinced, nicely or not nicely, all of them, and they were instructed to make a list of what's relevant or not. And that was fascinating, because I went into some of them, 10 minutes, they gave me a list. Here's what's relevant. They talked and agreed. Other domains, World War III started. They couldn't agree. One said, I use this. The other expert, no, this is totally irrelevant. I never base my decision based on this. I base it. So that really asks a more fundamental question, what is even relevant for you to ask or not? And I don't know in your domain, if you would all sit together, if you all agree, oh, this is important and this is important and this is never relevant, you'll say that, and whether your colleague will say, hey, that's right or something. What do you mean you use this? I never ask about it. I don't think it's relevant in assessing if somebody is going to recommit a crime, and something that you never use. I base my entire opinion on this. So that is a good discussion to have regardless of cognitive bias. What is relevant or not when you do a task? Where you should go and where you shouldn't go, and where sometimes you go and sometimes you don't go in a specific case. So that's a challenge I throw to your domain. Then I move to the specific case. In many cases, where the detectives and the prosecutors and the defense give you a lot of information, it's not to manipulate you. They really don't know what you need to know because they're not experts in your domain. It's not always sinister. Most of the time it is, but not always, in my view. And what you can do, and we have a paper elaborating, is to have case managers. So one person, and that is easier to do in a laboratory where you have a number of people or a team, one person gets all the information, and then another person is the one doing the actual evaluation, and the case manager decides what's relevant or not in this case. And if you don't have a lab, you may do it between colleagues. You may pair up with a colleague and do that, or you may make your decision knowing all the irrelevant information, but letting them check your conclusion by only giving them the relevant information, like when I ask a professor. So you know you've been briefed and you make a decision, and then you double check by giving it to another colleague. They don't do a lot of work. You just give them the very, very relevant information. And if they reach the same conclusion, first of all, you professionally know that your decision was not biased by the information. And you can write it in your report that to be more religious than the Pope and to be super careful, you took your conclusion and gave it to another examiner, and you took out a lot of the background gossip that was given, and you know you're doing a good job. And in court, when they ask you about cognitive bias and they told you this and they told you that, I say, yes, I was, and I cannot be sure that I was not biased, but I know because I gave it to my colleague who didn't know that and reach the same conclusion. So that's about a specific case, but generally it will be a really good step without cognitive bias, and I don't know how much it exists or not in your domain in different tests when people follow them, where they go and where they don't go, what's relevant or not.
Thank you. I'm Mary Duff. I'm from New Zealand. I'm forensic psychiatrist. I'm desperately in need of a drink now and a new profession probably as well. So
I had mine before the talk.
Excellent, very sensible. Yes, we'll check what's in it's gin. So I guess my question is that you're discussing the impact of this on experts, but the same question could presumably be applied to judges and juries, and the whole system, therefore, presumably is subject to the same biases.
Judges and jurors, a can of worms. Yes, absolutely. So first of all, they don't claim to be scientists. At least the judge who makes a verdict when there is no jurors or when there are jurors never claim what most of you claim. I'm trained and I'm impartial and I'm a scientist, and this is a scientific conclusion based on the static 99R with a meta-analysis of 60 studies showing it's reliable and valid, and believe me. So the judge and the doctor and the jurors don't speak like that. So you speak with a lot of confidence in the name of science often. Maybe you don't. Maybe you come to court and say, I'm subjective and this is my opinion and it's an art and it's not a science. And if you bring somebody else, they'll give you a different opinion. And in fact, if you bring me again on the same case, I'll probably say something different next week. I don't know what you do. I'm serious. That was not a joke, but okay. I don't. So the first of all, they don't claim to do that. They did a lot of work with judges and jurors and detectives, absolutely. Two, because jurors and judges are so susceptible to those and other biases, and when they actually make the verdict human memory, they don't even remember a lot of the evidence, and I can talk for hours on that, they are a lost case. You are the hope, because the system is so problematic with jurors and judges who are untrained, and even if they're trained, make real biasing decisions. The only glimmer of hope is forensic evidence. The only glimmer of hope that you come and against all the other evidence and the detective and the past criminal record and eyewitnesses and whatever, you come and you're able and you have that potential. I'm not asking you to do something you can't do. I cannot ask jurors to do things they can't, but you can develop the procedures, the cognitive best practices like linear sequential masking, like case manager, to be the light in this system which is broken. You know, the president of the university, he said it's broken. Yes, there are big problems with it, and the solutions and the help are not going to come, in my view, from the jurors or even from the judges, and I work with judges, and it's going to come from the forensic domain. That's why I'm talking to you, because I believe if you adopt and take on and understand some of the pitfalls, we can overcome with being optimistic, minimize and really do a better job and contribute to a system that needs a contribution because the other parts are very, very weak. So you're the part who can keep the system going or improve it mainly. There are two questions over there, and now there's like 5 questions. Let me look at the time. Oh, it's 6 o'clock. 2 questions there, and the other people catch me at the break. Yes.
A simple question. How can we be sure that your research is not biased?
That's an easy one. My research is very biased. Yes, of course I'm biased. Every time I find bias in my research, I'm on a high, I'm really happy, I'm really motivated. So I don't analyze my data. Because if I analyze it unintentionally, I'll trim the data in a certain way, and I'll pick a statistic that will give me what I want. That's why I have other people doing the analysis and the data collection because of that. And they don't know what the study is about. It's double-blind research method 101, and then I give it to a statistician. Here is group A, here is group B. Are they statistically different? Doesn't know what it's about. And then they work, and I can have a drink because I'm not allowed to do any of the work myself. So it's even better. It's an excuse not to get my hand. So it's absolutely like a placebo, double-blind. It's all done because I'm very, very biased. The difference is that I, in contrast to some people, I'm not saying you specifically, Acknowledge, my name is ETL Dror and I'm an alcoholic, right? That's half of the solution of alcoholism, right? Is acknowledging the problem. So I acknowledge that I'm biased, I'm very biased, and because of that, I take measures to minimize it. Now I ask you and all of you, are you biased? And if you say, yes, I'm biased, great, and now you can think with me or without me how to minimize it. But if you say, not only to me, to the court, I'm unbiased and I'm impartial, then we have a problem. And that's why you have to agree on the pitfalls to start thinking and having the discussions what we can do and solve it and minimize it. And when we can't, to acknowledge the weaknesses and limitations of what we're doing. It's such an optimistic note. I apologize for not giving you a question now. Come and catch me in the break. Thank you very much and good luck.